period of time when the axis of resistance, which includes Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis, they suddenly came into the news a lot, even though they have been organically present for a very long time. So how do you define the Houthi group?
So put probably most basically, the Houthis are a Zaidi revivalist movement originally from the mountains of northern Yemen that are seeking to, depending on who you ask, if you ask the Houthis themselves, they'll say that their mission is to defend Yemen from outside aggression and ensure sort of Yemeni sovereignty as part of the axis of resistance against this grand conspiracy by Israel and the West against Yemen and the Middle East more generally. If you ask some of their critics, they'll say that more or less they're attempting to institute some kind of, totalitarian theocracy in the areas of northern Yemen. To understand the Houthis, you have to understand Yemeni history.
So good morning. It is very good morning in DC. It's 7:30 in the morning, and it is 6 o'clock in India right now. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. This is Middle East Insights platform, and my name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, and we welcome you to our special Israel-Palestine expert talk series, in which today we are going to have Nicholas Brumfield, who is a DC-based Middle East political researcher with a focus on Yemen and specifically maritime security. So we are going to talk about the attacks on Houthis, the attacks by Houthis on the Red Sea, and what it does mean for Israel. What exactly is so-called axis of resistance, or in fact, who are the Houthis? They are being labeled as terrorist organizations. So different countries have different kinds of definitions, right? So my first question to you, sir, is that what was the reason that you chose to specialize in this topic?
So I went to school. I did my undergraduate in political science, focused on the Middle East, and then did my graduate studies at Georgetown in Arab studies. So I've always been very interested in sort of the comparative politics, in particular, of the Middle East, and sort of the local, very, very local dynamics, and sort of understanding those at certain levels. So I've specialized in a number of different Arab countries' politics. I did my research master's thesis on Jordan, sort of looking at that, and then sort of through a variety of work experiences, ultimately sort of became some sort of, some person people like to ask about Yemen, I guess is the way to say it. I've been working on Yemen and sort of following the Yemen conflict for about 6 years now on a pretty daily basis, sort of looking at the sort of media sort of coming out from all the different factions within the Yemen conflict and trying to understand that, trying to, work with Yemenis where I've been able to sort of produce good knowledge and information about the conflict and Yemen just as a country. So, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, Yemen is actually, since I don't want to use the symbolism of October 7, but over the period of time when the axis of resistance, which includes Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis, they suddenly came into the news a lot, even though they have been organically present for a very long time. So how do you define the Houthi group?
So put probably most basically, the Houthis are a Zaidi revivalist movement originally from the mountains of northern Yemen that are seeking to, depending on who you ask, if you ask the Houthis themselves, they'll say that their mission is to defend Yemen from outside aggression and ensure sort of Yemeni sovereignty as part of the axis of resistance against this grand conspiracy by Israel and the West against Yemen and the Middle East more generally. If you ask some of their critics, they'll say that more or less they're attempting to institute some kind of, totalitarian theocracy in the areas of northern Yemen. To understand the Houthis, you have to understand Yemeni history. For about 1,000 years, Yemen, or at least northern Yemen, was ruled by an imamate, various parts of it by the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and it was very much a theocratic monarchy. In 1962, this was overthrown by a Republican revolution that saw the tribes sort of take control from Hashemites or descendants of the Prophet Muhammad in northern Yemen, and the Houthis. They're an agglomeration of a number of decades-long currents in Middle East politics, but really viewed in the long term, they really are sort of a reaction to that loss of power by the old elites in northern Yemen, and they very much see themselves sort of in that tradition of the imamate, although they are sort of not necessarily trying to directly reestablish the imamate so much as kind of like a republic with a supreme leader. So there's influence from the Iranian Revolution, there's influence from the Palestinian Intifadas. So it all kind of came together in the early 2000s, where they launched an open rebellion against the Yemeni government and fought numerous wars with the Yemeni government, and progressively over the course of the 2000s and 2010s came to expand until eventually taking over the capital Sana'a in 2014, which sort of initiated a civil war that has been going on, an internationalized civil war, it should be noted, since 2015, and that's sort of where we're at. So over the last decade or so, they've been more or less claiming to be the Yemeni state. They claim to be a continuation of the government of the Republic of Yemen, and leading a coalition of anti sort of aggression parties. But more or less, they are kind of instituting a very radically different kind of state in areas of northern Yemen that is a bit scarier than before.
So, as much as I know, Yemen is comparatively much more intricately tribal than most of the other regions in West Asia.
I don't know if you could say it's more so or less. I studied Jordan, for instance, and that's also a pretty tribal area. But yeah, it is fair to say that large parts of Yemen, in large parts of Yemen, tribes are an important social and political actor, and they have been for a very long time to varying degrees. Tribes remain important military and political actors to constrain or strengthen the power of the state, depending on how social alliances are going. So for instance, the 1962 revolution I alluded to kind of empowered tribes in a very big way. The tribes are still very important in northern Yemen. The Houthis are very much conscious of the power of the tribes, for instance, and even in southern Yemen, they're important. But for instance, the Houthis are kind of marginalizing tribes in a way that they weren't necessarily prior to 2015. The powerful tribes, they're still very powerful, but you're not hearing their names in the same way that you were before, because the Houthis are kind of using large amounts of violence to rein them in and putting their own people in power and that kind of thing.
So when they started revolting against the Yemeni state, was it because they got less concessions, political representation, socioeconomic benefits from the Yemeni state? Was it a socioeconomic reason?
So it's a mix of things. As following the Republican Revolution in the 60s and 70s, the Yemeni state, off and on, I would say, sponsored or at least allowed Saudi parties in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere to sponsor Salafi centers of dawah, that kind of thing, Dar al-Hadith, that sort of spread a kind of Sunni ideology in areas of Yemen that were historically Zaidi Islam. People say it's part of Shia Islam. It kind of is, and with the Houthis' alliance with Iran, it's increasingly kind of getting entangled. But Zaydi Islam is a distinct brand of Islam that's really been unique to northern Yemen and southwestern Saudi Arabia for a very long time. That is very close to Shafi'i Islam, but it also sort of it was kind of the main ideological basis for the Yemenites. So large portions of the Yemeni highlands are Zaydi. So what we saw following the Republican Revolution is the Yemeni state sort of in an attempt to maybe marginalize the Emimate and the parties that had ruled for a very long time, where it was trying to sort of come up with a synthesis, an ideological synthesis that could form the basis of the republic. And so they were sort of allowing these Dar al-Hadith centers to be set up. And that ticked off a lot of Zaydis, and people, the Houthis are very much a Zaydi group. They're Hashemites. The Hashemites were the dominant sort of social caste in Yemeni society under the sort of Zaydi imamate. And so when you saw this coming in the 70s and 80s, that started ticking a lot of people off. This led to a Zaydi revivalist movement in northern Yemen, far northern Yemen more broadly in the 1990s. And the Houthis sort of came out of this. Of course, socioeconomic issues were another sort of reason, both because sort of the Houthis were considered themselves part of an increasingly marginalized sort of social caste, but also because the Republic was not able or was unwilling to deliver the kind of wide-ranging socioeconomic development a lot of people expect from sort of new states. Not just in northern Yemen, but really across Yemen. They relied much more on sort of tribal networks of co-optation rather than delivering broad-based benefits to really most any areas of Yemen. So you had those sort of things happen. And then you also had the global war on terror taking place sort of in the early 2000s. That resulted in the Saleh regime, which was a firm ally of the United States, or a firm ally, but a very unreliable and sort of ambiguous ally who would often use the global war on terror to sort of get foreign support for his regime and sort of play people off of each other, that kind of thing. And so all of that sort of coalesced in, the Saleh regime sort of cracking down on sort of, the Houthis got a little bit, were very sort of critical perhaps of U.S. foreign policy, of the Saleh regime's foreign policy in the context of the Second Intifada. The Saleh regime was sort of cracking down on that, and all of that sort of boiled together to come out and make this sort of, they call them the Sada Wars between 2004 and 2010. There were a series of 6 wars fought in the far northern Yemen mountains, very isolated, very rugged, very brutal, increasingly brutal kind of guerrilla warfare and that kind of thing. And that is the sort of cauldron that the Houthi movement was forged in these very sort of essentially hiding in caves from Yemeni government forces that were much more better equipped than them, and then increasingly sort of developing the capabilities to fight them and beat them.
So in a simpler way for the students to understand, would it be right to say that Houthis are a Shia organization like Hezbollah?
Increasingly so. Obviously, as a Yemen guy, I'm very much like, it's not a Shia thing, it's a Zaydi thing, because it's very particular to Yemeni society. But increasingly, I think Iranian influence on the Houthi movement is increasingly evident. There is a sense of sort of ecumenical, if you can use that term, sort of relations among the axis of resistance groups, and it's sort of a desire or a tendency to sort of copy one another and share ideology. You have seen the Houthis introduce holidays and sort of religious sort of aspects that were not necessarily as similar to what was present in Yemen or Zaydi Islam in Yemen before, that a lot of people are saying is, this is Iranian Shia influence, is sort of at least what their critics are saying. Broadly, I think you could group them under that, with the caveat that, Zaydi Islam is not historically 12 or Shia Islam. It's not 7 or Islam. It's a different thing.
And how, for example, like the Kurdish forces, they have a lot of women fighters. How about Houthis? Do they have a lot of women fighters?
No, the Houthis are incredible. Okay, so there's a couple ways to answer that. The Houthis are pretty oppressive towards women. Yemen as a society in general is a fairly conservative society, both in Houthi areas and non-Houthi areas, and among all the different factions. The Houthis have been much more systematic in their sort of repression of women's sort of rights and organizations. You saw a couple of years ago, they very infamously detained a model on a Yemeni model who had posted photos on Instagram on charges of immoral indecency or something along those lines. They're segregating schools by sex in ways that they weren't before. They're segregating society by sex in ways that they weren't before. That said, they do have this group, the sort of organization within their security apparatus called the Zainabiyat, which they use to enforce this sort of stricter moral codes on society, because men can't go into women's spaces. So they have sort of women's paramilitary organizations that do this for them. But in terms of frontline fighters or something like that, no, they don't have any women fighters.
And why is Yemen geopolitically important? That apart from Saudi Arabia intervening, why is Yemen important?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, it's right there on the Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aden. These are all very strategically important waterways for world trade. The Houthi maritime attacks that have been going on for the past year have significantly impacted the sort of amount of trade going through the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. I was just reading a report, sort of that offered the analysis that in terms of its effect on world sort of prices and that kind of thing, it's probably not been as bad as sort of some people were thinking in terms, predicting a year ago. But at the same time, it has had very, very real effects. The port of Eilat in Israel had to declare bankruptcy as a result of these attacks. The Suez Canal in Egypt, which is a major revenue source for the Egyptian government, is posting pretty large losses. You're having shipping companies having to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope instead of directly through the Suez Canal. So it is having effects, and that's really probably the major sort of international concern for folks. Obviously, also for Saudi Arabia, which is a major player in the region, the reason why they intervened in Yemen is because it is so sort of close and sort of integral to conceptions of Saudi security that it's very concerned and remains very concerned to this day about, sort of what happens in Yemen, to the extent that, it is definitely going to maintain a presence there for a while, I think.
And when the attacks by Houthis on the Red Sea started, in your analysis, how do they get the funding to carry on such kind of attacks?
So the Houthis' capabilities to carry out these attacks come from a couple different places. In terms of funding, the Houthis so obviously the Houthis do get some financial support from Iran. I think that through illicit oil shipments, that kind of thing. The U.S. has sanctioned an entire network of smugglers and stuff that are sort of getting money for the Houthis, that kind of thing. At the same time, though, it's worth noting that the Houthis are fairly unique among the members of the Iran-led axis of resistance in the fact that they actually do control the state in northern Yemen. So as a result of taking over Sana'a and 70% of Yemen's population, the Houthis are directly ruling, like what could be called a de facto state, and they control customs, they control taxes, they're able to collect these things in a way that perhaps even Hezbollah isn't necessarily capable of. So they do have their own sort of revenue sources and like an economy to draw from. In terms of the capabilities to do these attacks, most analysts the Houthis say that they manufacture all these weapons themselves, that they're Yemeni design. But every analyst worth their salt you ask is these are Iranian designs that are either sort of being sort of constructed in Yemen or imported in Yemen, or essential components of which are being imported into Yemen through there's a land border crossing with Iran where they've seized a bunch of stuff through maritime routes in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. So it is fairly intricate. It is worth noting that some of the more limited capabilities that the Houthis I mean, they also, for instance, get drone components imported from China just commercially. Like, some of this stuff is commercially available. Not that China's sending it to them, but you can order it and get it fairly easily. But some, so they do have some capabilities on their own, but the larger stuff, the more hypersonic missile stuff, that's definitely coming from Iran.
Now, turning to what is the impact of the attacks by Houthis on Israel?
Mm-hmm.
So they have been attacking central Israel for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
There was also this assassination attempt on Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm.
The moment, I think 2 months back.
Mm-hmm.
And so what kind of missiles can be used from Yemen to strike at Israel? What is the range?
So the range off the top of my head, I mean, I think they have missiles that can go 1,500 miles, the distance between, or at least they claim to have missiles that can go 1,500 miles. They recently unveiled a new missile, which is based on an Iranian model, as I understand it, called a Palestine 2 missile, which they've been very fond of over the course of they very much like to make theater out of these attacks and sort of like to post videos and have very evocative titles and everything. So they've claimed multiple, particularly over the course of the last couple of weeks, they've claimed several attacks against Israel using these missiles. It's worth noting that a lot of the time they lie and that there's no independent verification that these attacks, now some attacks, they absolutely do occur. You will see from time to time, reports of intercepted drones or missiles, mostly in southern Israel, where Israel will take them out. They have gotten a couple through. So, for instance, that attack in Tel Aviv back in July that killed someone and then resulted in Israel bombing the port of Hodeidah, which is a very important port. So every once in a while they'll get through, but the vast majority don't, or they miss, or they actually never occurred. So in terms of its concrete impacts on Israel, this sort of material effects on ordinary people from the attacks on Israel directly aren't necessarily all that impactful. Psychologically, of course, it's important, and it also forces Israel and the United States, which deployed large amounts of naval assets to the Red Sea to intercept a lot of these attacks, to sort of direct some of its missile defense systems to the south. So those missile defense systems are very directional. So you can point them at Hezbollah in the north, or you can point them at Iraq to the east, or you can point them at Hamas to the southwest, or to the Houthis in this. So having another direction, a compass point to come at Israel from, was a big strategic sort of win for the axis of resistance, because it makes them spread out their missile defenses.
What I got to know was also that after constantly, like last year, this time, they were much more rigorous. And then somehow China intervened to secure the maritime shipping route. Is it correct?
So there's been a lot of rumors around sort of China and Russia sort of, securing concessions and everything from the Houthis with regards to that. If you look at the specific sort of attack sort of patterns, it's not super clear that's the case, or if it is the case, the Houthis aren't necessarily the best at aiming or targeting. So they have, for instance, struck multiple vessels associated with the Russian dark fleet that's transporting oil. They have struck a Chinese-owned vessel several months ago. So yeah, and in terms of their targeting, so they have hit Russia and China. And if you look at it in the long span of things, they go through cycles. I've noticed. So there will be back in April of 2024, for instance, they basically did nothing, and everyone was like, "Oh, we exhausted the Houthis, they're done," and then they just started again, or they, it's difficult to sort of discern the attack cycles in these, but they aren't necessarily, the fact that they don't do something for a couple of weeks isn't necessarily a sign that they're exhausted.
And for example, because of the geostrategic positioning, the presence of Houthis is something of a concern for Saudi Arabia, for Oman, for Eritrea, for Ethiopia, for Sudan, for Egypt, and the Levant. Yeah. So has any kind of spillover taken place from the Houthis? Like, are they only in Yemen? Do they also spill over to any of these other countries?
So there's a couple of different ways to look at that. There have been, I would say, less credible reports that, for instance, they're cooperating a bit more with Al Shabaab in Somalia than they were before in terms of smuggling, or potentially sort of like some of it could be anti-Houthi propaganda. So it's very important to note that, like, you have people coming out and saying, oh, they're cooperating with Somali pirates a bit more, which could be true. I don't know. So there's that. It's also worth noting that in response to the attacks from the Houthis, Israel has adopted a much more forward position in the sort of Gulf of Aden, sort of Bab el-Mandeb, Gulf of Aden area. So there are reports that Israel's interested in increasing its position in Somaliland to sort of provide a vantage point to look at the Houthis a bit closer. Israel's relatively close relationship with the United Arab Emirates is also important to note here, because the United Arab Emirates has multiple sort of armed groups that it backs in southern Yemen as part of the anti-Houthi coalition. Tariq Saleh's National Resistance Forces are on the southwest coast and are very well positioned to sort of overlook the Bab el-Mandeb. You have had for years reports from Houthi propaganda that the UAE is helping Israel build military positions on the island of Socotra as part of sort of looking at this wider sort of littoral. Whether Israel's involved in that, I'm not sure, but there is pretty solid evidence that the UAE is building military positions on the island of Socotra. So there is this very intricate sort of network of different sort of groups and everything that sort of does span outside of Yemen into the littoral as well.
And how do they, like, for example, the Red Sea? So how do they target the ships that are carrying oil or any kind of other exports?
Yeah, so in terms of the physical process of them targeting it, it seems to have varied across time, or at least they have multiple vectors. So, for instance, it is well known that they use publicly available AIS. So you or me can go online and go to these AIS sites and track ships. So that's definitely one of the things that they use. Although a lot of ships are turning their AIS off as they're transiting the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. For a while there was, I think, a well-founded belief that Iranian warships that were sort of based in the Red Sea, ostensibly as part of counter-piracy efforts or anti-smuggling efforts, is what they said, were using their sensors to more or less provide targeting data to the Houthis. This was earlier on in the campaign. There were reports perhaps of a U.S. cyber attack on one of these that may have put some of them out of commission. And then most recently, there were reports that Russia was actually providing targeting information to the Houthis as part using its satellites and its sort of sensor networks as part of essentially a way to get back at the United States for its support of Ukraine. And there have been talks in recent months. It's unclear if they've actually done anything yet, that Russia was considering giving the Houthis more advanced anti-ship missiles as part of their campaign. There are definitely Russians in Sana'a right now talking about it, at least according to fairly credible reports, I would say. So there's it, and then obviously the Houthis also have their own ground sensors in Yemen that they use, although the U.S. has been trying very hard, I think, to take those out with its ongoing international bombing campaign.
So a lot of ships, which I heard that were transporting exports to Israel, they took their flags down.
In terms of the sort of targeting methodology, that has also shifted across time. Currently, I believe the current targeting methodology is any ship associated with the U.S., United Kingdom, or Israel, or servicing Israeli ports, or part of a company or ownership structure that has ships servicing Israeli ports will be targeted. So this gets very, very Byzantine. So in terms, people have been trying to track, sort of what ships belong to who, and what ships will the Houthis consider it's safe or not. Whether or not the Houthis are strenuously adhering to this targeting methodology, I think is still a bit unclear. But they do make a deal out of saying that is what they're trying to target and everything. And yeah, you have seen some ships, for instance, over the course of the last couple months, people trying to sell ships away from, so companies that are sort of have ships that are affected are trying to sell them to other people. And the Houthis just recently actually came out and said they're going to target any ship that has ever sort of been implicated, even if it's sold or elsewhere or it changes its flag, because this could be an elaborate scheme to get us to stop targeting them. So yeah, it gets very messy in terms of exactly who they're targeting. But yeah, it's not. It's general. I mean, if you look at the grand numbers of ships going through the Bab el-Mandeb, it's generally safe, I guess, to go through the Bab el-Mandeb. But it's definitely increased insurance rates. It's definitely increased concerns among seafarers. There's been a lot of concerns about that. So it is kind of a mess.
And why, in your analysis, why do the Houthis support the Palestinian cause?
So for a number of reasons. One, and this often gets discounted in analyses of the Houthis, because there's a lot of analyses, and I wrote one that sort of portray them as fairly Machiavellian political actors with interests that they're sort of satisfying with this, and that's very true. But it's also worth noting that like the Houthis are committed ideologues in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is that they're committed to Palestine, but also to a very sort of virulent anti-Semitic sort of understanding of anti-Israel, like calling for the physical destruction of Israel. That's been part of their foundational ideology since they were founded in the early 2000s. Death, the flag has, death to America, death to Israel, curse to the Jews. So that's sort of a foundational ideological aspect. And I don't want to underplay that, because a lot of analyses that focus on the more material aspects are due. But it's also worth noting that the Houthis get a lot of political cachet from this in Yemen when they're doing it. Palestine is a broadly popular issue in Yemen among all parties, not just the Houthis, not just their supporters, but really everybody. And for the past year, they've held thousands of rallies in support of Palestine, in support of Hamas or various other parties. And there's also been a bunch of rallies in non-Houthi areas in support of Palestine. So like, this is just a generally broadly popular move, I would say, in terms of us, screw the Americans, screw Israel, we're going to support the Palestinians. It's also worth noting that this has been a boon for the Houthis within the axis of resistance. As you said, they were kind of considered a bit player compared to Hezbollah and Iran prior to October 7th, and in the years since, they've kind of become one of the main players. So they like sort of being able to present themselves as this regional player that's been able to take the hits that Israel and the United States has given it in a way that Hezbollah hasn't. They have very close relationship with Hezbollah. Very good, very, very good friends, I would say. But I think they like it. I think they like being able to sort of play this part, and it really feeds into their self-perception going back 20 years. This is what they've been saying that they've been wanting to do for a very long time.
And how was the reaction after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah by the Houthis?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I mean, so I think it was fairly normal in the sense that he was martyred. We support his struggle. The struggle goes on. This is a movement that, it's worth noting the Houthi movement started, or at its very beginning, the founder of the Houthi movement during the first Sada war, at the end of it, was taken out of a cave by Yemeni government forces and shot in the head. So this is a movement that very much believes in the cult of martyrdom, that is very much sort of along the lines of Hezbollah in that way. And so, yeah, their tolerance for death and pain is very high, particularly after over a decade of war and several years of Saudi-led coalition airstrikes that killed several senior Houthi leaders. So it is that kind of movement.
And who is the main Houthi leader who is carrying out the decision-making process as of now?
So yeah, so I mean, so the Houthis, there's a fairly involved decision-making structure with their different factions and everything. So, but in terms of the guy who's at the head of it, who likes to, I guess, portray himself as more or less the supreme leader of Yemen, is Abdul Malik al-Houthi, who is the brother of the founder of the Houthi movement, Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi, and he's led the Houthi movement since his brother's death in 2004. He's very kind of an enigmatic figure. No one knows where he is, and no one has known where he is for a very long time. The only time you ever see him is with that blue backdrop or green backdrop or whatever backdrop they're choosing to do when he likes to give sermons and likes to portray himself as kind of this reclusive sort of spiritual figure who is sort of giving sermons to the Yemeni people, and he does this on a fairly regular basis. They'll publish these. But yeah, so he's kind of ahead, and generally in terms of what he says goes. He does have, I think, a fairly good handle on the movement. Of course, there are other sort of more, not more minor, but sort of secondary figures, all of whom are either his family members or very, very closely associated with him. So it's worth noting that the Houthi, at least senior leadership, is very much a family affair of people either from the Houthi family who married into the Houthi family, or people that they were fighting with 20 years ago in Sada and the caves that they have very, very tight relationships with. And it's a very tight movement in that regard.
And how many countries in the West have designated Houthis as a terrorist organization as of now?
Ooh, that's a good question, and one I don't necessarily have an exact number for. So I know, obviously, the United States designated them a specially designated global terrorist organization, which is one step below a foreign terrorist organization. And there's a lot of concerns that if the United States, particularly under President Donald Trump, who tried to do it as he was leaving last time, designates them a foreign terrorist organization, that could really mess up the Yemeni economy in a big way. But recently, we also had Canada sort of designate them a terrorist organization, and Australia as well. There may be a couple other countries that have done it. To be honest, I don't remember if the EU had done it. But really, the big question with regards to terrorist designations is whether the U.S. will do an FTO and whether that will destroy the Yemeni economy, because under an FTO, it more or less makes it impossible to do any transactions that are associated with a terrorist entity. And the Houthis control something like 70% of Yemen's economy. So that's the major concern.
And in DC, do you have a Yemeni's embassy?
Yeah, there is a Yemeni embassy in DC. There is a Yemeni ambassador. This is controlled by the internationally recognized Yemeni government, not the Houthis. And so, so this is the government that is ostensibly attempting to lobby the United States to increase support for it in the civil war against the Houthis. It's also worth noting that it's not an official embassy. It does not have any official recognition, but the Southern Transitional Council, which is another component of the anti-Houthi alliance that is ostensibly sort of part of the Yemeni government, but also just kind of wants to leave and separate southern Yemen from North Yemen, because they used to be two separate countries and it's a separatist movement, also has been establishing international representation in the United States and elsewhere.
And does U.S. have an embassy in Yemen?
The U.S., it did have an embassy in Sana'a. It was evacuated, and since then, a number of Yemeni employees that worked for the U.S. embassy have been abducted by the Houthis and more or less, tortured, forced to confess to crimes, that kind of thing. They've done a lot of this over the last year as they've been trying to sort of make a show of rooting out "quote unquote" American spies as part of in response to the U.S.-led bombing campaign. Currently, the U.S. the representation in Yemen is based in Riyadh, and that's where a lot of the internationally recognized government of Yemen officials are at anyway. So that's where they do a lot of their sort of interfacing.
And how do the Houthis target dark ships?
I'm sorry?
How do they target the dark ships? The dark ships are,
So I mean,
GPS.
Yeah, so this is them using other forms of detection, ground radar, Russian satellites, Iranian sort of warship sensors that I was discussing earlier. So they do have access to other forms of detection outside of the open source GPS.
And say, for example, as an entity, say I'm Russian entity with the state or outside of the state, or I'm with Hezbollah, or I'm with the Iranian entity. Any kind of bank transaction that I do with the Houthis will have a detailed footprint. So how do they do this kind of fundings? Like, is it cash mostly?
So there are fairly intricate smuggling networks that sort of move stuff around. That as part of this, there is. So, for instance, one of the more prominent ones, for instance, is essentially what Iran will do is will export oil or gas using sort of its network of ships that make it somewhat more difficult to detect, although you can still detect them. And they'll ship that to the port of Hodeidah, which is Houthi controlled, and they'll essentially give the Houthis that oil for free. And then the Houthis will sell that within Yemen and pocket the cash off of that. That's one major way that they've done it.
And what is the entire narrative? If you look at it from the perspective of the Israeli state, apart from, the bombarding and trying to put it as a terrorist organization, do you think either the Houthis or the Israeli state has any clear-cut plan to deal with each other?
I think the Houthis their plan is pretty laid out in terms of we're going to keep doing this until they stop Gaza. And there are some people that think that they'll continue even after they stop Gaza. I'm not one. I think if Israel withdrew from Gaza and Lebanon and sort of did all of that, I think the Houthis would power down, at least for now. Long term, they still present a large sort of threat to international shipping. But they've been very clear that that's their goal and that they're going to keep doing this. And they've done stuff like this for years. Like, so in terms of Saudi Arabia, they were launching missiles at Saudi Arabia for years and getting bombarded by Saudi warplanes and everything. And they just kept doing it. And it just became like a weekly thing. And I think the Houthis think that they can keep this up for a while. In terms of the Israeli state's response to it, particularly if Lebanon is sort of becoming less of a major front for them, I am sort of concerned that Israel is going to turn towards Yemen and do some things with regards to Yemen that could be pretty damaging to vital infrastructure. So Israel so far has done two major sort of responses to the Houthi attacks. The first was an attack on Hodeidah port on July 20th. And the second was an attack on Ras Isa port, which was, I forget the exact date, it was later in the year. But more or less, this has been targeting vital infrastructure that has been used to import fuel into into Houthi-held areas, which the Houthis have of course been using to obviously do this network with Iran, where they get oil and stuff and make money. But it's also the network that 20 million Yemenis rely on to get their fuel and other such things. So I think Israel thinks that perhaps it can maybe do this a couple more times and see what happens. They may attempt, although their intelligence networks historically have not been as good in Yemen as they were in Lebanon, they may try to sort of do some more assassination attempts or sort of more specific assassination attempts against Houthi leadership, although this has not worked before when the Saudis tried it. And obviously, they're also maybe trying to ally themselves with Somaliland, for instance, is the one that comes up. But the UAE and the sort of groups in southern Yemen that the UAE backs it is another sort of ripe territory for them to try to position themselves and get allies on the ground to maybe do stuff a bit closer to home for the Houthis. For the Yemeni party's part, the non-Houthi Yemeni party's part, all of them are vigorously lobbying the international community to more or less support them against the Houthis, with weapons and support that kind of stuff, and more or less trying to sell themselves as like, we can stop the Houthis, just support us more. So that's just something to be aware of as well.
And look at so Saudi Arabia is here and Yemen is here. The oil fields of Saudi Arabia, wherever maximum of them are located, they're in the Shia-dominated areas mostly.
Yeah.
So, what has been the connection between the Shia community in Saudi Arabia and the Houthis?
So it's, excuse me. I would say it's tenuous. So in terms, so the Houthis have, over the course of the last several years, claimed support or involvement with a variety of militant groups in Saudi Arabia itself, that were sort of anti-regime. But in terms of verifiable kinetic events or stuff actually happening, that's been fairly sparse in terms of reporting. The Houthis have also received in Sana'a representatives from what they call the Saudi opposition. So a lot of anti-regime Saudi figures have found favor in Sana'a, and they'll take Instagram stories together, that kind of thing, as a propaganda win. In terms of, and this I think gets back to perhaps the difference between Zaydis and Shia in terms of the kind of Shia in Saudi Arabia that are more related to the Houthis. They're in southwestern Saudi Arabia, and that border region has been very heavily militarized as a result of the last 10 years of war. And so, yeah, in terms of attacks and that kind of thing, you don't hear about them so much in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that's there. And do you think that over the period of time, with because the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire yesterday night, for example, Hezbollah launched an attack, Israel launched an attack, the drones were back. I don't know what is the legitimacy of this ceasefire. Mm-hmm. But do you think that this will have any repercussions on the Houthis? It will add to their vendetta?
No. I think the Houthis so the Houthis go through what they call, rounds of escalation. They're currently in the 5th round of escalation. So periodically they'll come out with a new sort of set of rules or a new sort of statement saying that now we're dialing it up a notch. So, they may do that sooner rather than later. But in terms of sort of what they're doing and what they're committed to, I think they've been fairly consistent that they're going to keep doing this, and if they come up with new ways to do it, they're going to do that. So long as the Israeli attack on Gaza continues, the breakdown in the ceasefire in Lebanon, I don't imagine is going to substantively make things better or worse for them. The major sort of strategic perspective I'm adopting with regards to the Lebanon ceasefire is it could free up Israel to maybe go after the Houthis a little harder.
If it then
if it holds.
If it does not keep bombarding Beirut and Baker Valley and all of them.
Course.
And how is for example, how do you predict, because in the coming months, when Trump gets to office, mm-hmm. how would, because the Lebanese American Mashad Bulus has been made the head of the Arab Middle Eastern affairs. Mm-hmm. So how would the Trump administration have an impact on the Houthis?
I think that they will adopt a harder line on the Houthis without necessarily. So the Biden administration, although it has conducted international airstrikes across Yemen for the almost last year now, since January 2024, in response to Houthi shipping attacks, they've been fairly limited. They have resulted in civilian casualties at times, but in terms of their what they've gone after, it's been fairly limited to military targets. They have kept civilian casualties to a minimum. They haven't designated the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization. So you could see Trump in a bid to maybe try to show of strength, and the Israel, the Israel supporters are a big part of his sort of foreign policy coalition as it regards the Middle East. You could see him being like, we're going to be tough, and we're going to designate the Houthis an FTO, which is foreign terrorist organization, which they tried to do last time, regardless of its effects on the Yemeni economy. You could see him maybe authorizing a bit more harsher airstrikes that result in more civilian casualties. Whether or not that's going to result in any significant changes outside of humanitarian suffering, I'm somewhat suspect about. But that you could see him doing that. The big question for me is whether or not the Trump administration is going to substantively alter U.S. policy on the ground in Yemen. So U.S. policy thus far has been in support of UN-led efforts to sort of try to establish a political process and sort of a ceasefire in Yemen itself, even as it's kind of been interrupted by the Gaza crisis. Whether or not the U.S. under Trump would more substantively say, hey, we're going to give weapons to the Southern Transitional Council or the Yemeni government in a bid to try to fight the Houthis on the ground. That's the big question, in my opinion, because that could restart the Yemen war in a way that it's not been happening for the last 2 years. That's the big question. I lean towards no, but that's still something to be seen.
And when U.S. does a strike on Yemen, which military base does it use?
So it uses. So a lot of the time, I believe it's used its aircraft carriers that have been deployed in and around the region. A lot of the times, it's actually not been aircraft; it's been missile strikes that have occurred. So from destroyers and stuff. In terms of the specific military bases in the Middle East, to be honest, I can't tell you with regards to that. Although there is major concern among the Houthi side that the U.S. not use Saudi airspace or any of the other sort of Gulf states' airspace. And in particular, when Israel did that strike on the port of Hodeidah or the port of Ras Isa, there was public sort of footage that kind of implicated that they did use Saudi airspace, and the Saudis are very concerned about that because the Houthis have said if the U.S. or Israel uses sort of Saudi or Emirati assets to conduct these strikes, we're going to launch missiles at you. And Saudi Arabia, despite being at war with the Houthis for a very long time, very much don't want to restart the war in Yemen. They're scared as hell. It's kind of a bit of a historical irony that the Saudi-led coalition, which was the kind of pushing the U.S. to do more against the Houthis in Yemen for close to a decade, is now the party that is like saying, hey, like, let's not escalate things because we're almost out. That is.
And they're also diverting most of the economy in a future, which is post-oil economy, economy. And the point is also that when the Iran-Israel skirmishes took place, all the Gulf countries came and openly said that we are not going to allow US to use our airspace. Have they made any such strong statement for Houthis or no? It's only for Iran.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you mean in terms of no, they haven't made any strong statements with regards to. Although I think the Houthis may have been implicated in the statement about Iran.
Okay. Yeah, indirectly, yes.
Yeah. Essentially, just saying like we're not party to this conflict. So
yeah, and also Hamas, Hezbollah, they have also opened their offices or have some kind of networking in Latin America. Do you think Houthis also do that?
Not to my knowledge. So there is a fairly large Yemeni diaspora across large parts of the world. So there's a large diaspora in Malaysia, in India, even in the United Kingdom, in the United States. To my knowledge, they don't have a substantial population in Latin America, but so there is a very large Yemeni diaspora. They're from different parts of Yemen. Some of them are from areas that aren't necessarily kind of historically maybe sympathetic to the Houthis. Some of them are. So there is, like any diaspora, you have a wide sort of array of political beliefs that may or may not be aligned with the Houthis or not. In terms of like smuggling networks or that kind of thing, I don't necessarily see that happening anytime soon. That the Houthis are a fairly insular movement. That most of their leadership does not leave Yemen. I mean, they have an embassy in Iran, which is the only country that recognizes them as the government of Yemen. They do have informal delegations elsewhere in Iraq and Syria, that kind of thing. But yeah, in terms of like intricate transnational smuggling networks, I think most of them are going to be focused around Yemen, maybe in Oman, maybe in Saudi Arabia, that kind of thing.
And my last question to you, sir, is that in the next 6 months, though it's very difficult to predict.
Of course.
But how do you analyze because right now Syria is under complete chaos. And as far as the reports I have received, the head of HTS has been killed.
Oh, right. So I've seen those reports. Are those confirmed?
Yeah.
I haven't seen those confirmed.
Yeah, confirmed reports I have also not seen. So we
Okay.
don't know, but the resurgence of HTS will be an impetus for other umbrella groups in Syria to resurge, creating a civil war kind of situation.
Of course.
And with Syria completely in chaos, the Levant region, like, Lebanon and Israel, West Bank, Gaza, all of that being in complete chaos, Iraq being involved, Iran being involved, Hezbollah being weakened, Hamas being weakened. How do you see that? How, in the next 6 months, do you see Houthis um, carrying out something very symbolic?
I mean, more than they have thus far.
Yeah, something even larger.
So yeah, in terms of, so a lot of it comes down to capabilities, and so a lot of the escalations that we've seen from the Houthis over the course of the past year has been as they've developed their capabilities iteratively and sort of developed new ways to sort of do what they were. So they launched drone attacks at Israel in November of 2023, and they came nowhere close. Or, they launched a missile and it wasn't able to sort of hit anything. Anyone that sort of made it kind of crashed in Jordan, that kind of thing. But over the course of the last year, you've seen them sort of iteratively get better at it. So they took the long way around through Sudan and Egypt to come at Tel Aviv in July. They've gotten their hands on more hypersonic, not hyper. They claim they're hypersonic. I don't think they're actually hypersonic missiles that can sort of hit Israel. They've hit Israel a couple more times with these missiles in a way. So I think what you're going to see is them get better at sort of doing what they're doing and become more deadly at it. That's kind of generally what they did with Saudi Arabia. The big concern, so I mean, there are a couple avenues that they haven't done thus far that could scare crap out of people. One of them is naval mines. So they have not, to my knowledge, deployed naval mines in the Red Sea. Which they would be very difficult to detect and very difficult to sort of get. And you could just throw them out there and then it would just be chaos. And a lot of shipping companies would be very scared. They haven't done that yet because it's not very controllable. And they generally like to sort of control what they're doing and be fairly measured with it. But like that, for instance, is something that I was talking about a year ago. And now more people are talking about it in a way like, oh, they could very well do this. But yeah, in terms of symbolic stuff, yeah, that's sort of what my thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, it's so. Thank you so much, sir, for first of all taking our time at 7:30 in the morning, and
Thanks,
it is very very rare, and it takes a lot of energy. So thank you so much, and thank you for explaining these intricacies. Because most of what you have said is missing in the analytical media essays or researches that we have seen so far. There's a very strong dearth of, this kind of a very blackout when it comes to Yemen, in the international and domestic media also, and in the academia too. So there is a certain kind of blackout, somehow putting it lesser in the hierarchies of hotspots, even though they control most of the geopolitical choke points. So thank you so much, sir, and we are very privileged to have you spend this 1 hour with us.
No, thank you so much for having me. And I'm not sure if your students had any questions or anything, but I'm more than happy to take them.
Anyone has any question? The point here is that we don't talk about Yemen much. Even in the universities and the centers that specialize on Middle East or West Asia, as we call it, we don't talk about Yemen. Yemen doesn't. So the countries that, like For example, Kuwait and India next week are going to have a foreign exchange, a diplomatic meet.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about Kuwait, we don't talk about Bahrain, we don't talk about Oman much, we don't talk about Yemen, we don't talk about um, then on the other side, Sudan, South Sudan, many
Yeah,
others.
yeah.
We just not taught. It's not part of the pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. Which is very ironic. I mean, particularly based in India, right, or South Asia, very, very strong connections historically and at present between the two countries and between the regions. So yeah, no, we definitely probably should.
Moitru is asking, sir, that Iran is an upcoming player in drone technology.
Yeah, I mean,
How would it support the Houthis?
yeah, so Iran's been providing drone technology to the Houthis for close to a decade now. Essentially, all of the major sort of models that the Houthi use are more or less Iranian models. The Houthis seemingly have the capability to manufacture some of these in Yemen themselves, although some vital components are still needed from Iran at times. Um, Interestingly, for looking at it from an Iranian drone perspective, Yemen has been a very interesting test bed for them because they've been able to send their drones to Yemen and seen them deployed to actual combat for years now. So there's a feedback loop going on there as well. So it's part of the larger sort of Iranian sort of information network regarding that. So yeah, so I mean, so the Houthis have gotten very, very good at using Iranian drones and missiles to do very intricate things against various ships and targets. So for instance, they actually used, I believe it was a missile to just barely miss a ship that was attempting to dock in Yemen to take oil off of the Yemeni government-held oil fields. And so they've been able to use this very intricate use of Iranian weaponry to more or less blockade oil from leaving Yemen since 2022, which has had massive economic impact on the Yemeni government and given the Houthis a great deal of leverage. So they're very good at this stuff at this point.
How does Iran export? Does it use the land route or the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea route?
So yeah, so there are multiple routes. So one of them is to send it to Oman, and then sort of from Oman, either along the coastal sort of waterway or over land. There have been multiple interceptions at the border crossing between Oman and Yemen. Well, another one is to send it to Somalia and then ship it over from Somalia to Shabwa. And then the third one is to do it covertly, sort of through the Red Sea, directly to the Houthis. The first two routes actually go through Yemeni government-held areas, so there's possibilities for interception, but there's also a lot of really well-developed smuggling networks there that they're able to get them through.
And through the Red Sea, which country supports them, or which smuggling group supports them?
So for a while there, they had a ship, and I believe they still technically have a ship there. I don't remember where they would ship weapons to a ship and then bring it in via small boats. There's concern among the Yemeni government that they're actually, given the fact that the UN verification and inspection mechanism that is tasked with inspecting shipments going into Houthi-held Hodeidah port under a UN resolution, since it's kind of mostly been defunct and underfunded for the last couple of years, that Iran's more or less sending weapons in via container ship or something along those lines directly to the port of Hodeidah. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that they've done it.
And how many days in your, like, if they take, say, the Oman route or they take the Red Sea route, how many days does it take for them to export it to Yemen?
Oh, to be honest, I do not, no clue, but yeah. So yeah, I mean these are well-known, well-established smuggling routes that they've been using for years.
It's very interesting because one of the reasons why they operate in cycles can also be because they have this phase down period of cooling down to get the exports.
Possibly, very possibly.
Yeah. Prashant is asking if things escalate in the Red Sea, can we witness a joint mission from major countries, navies, on the Houthi, and if there it is happening, what would be the impact on countries who trade passes through, like their exports, imports pass through the Red Sea?
So yeah, so we have had multiple international task forces to sort of protect shipping in the Red Sea. You obviously have Operation Poseidon Archer, led by the United States and Prosperity Guardian. You also have Operation Aspides, led by the European Union. China has some deployments sort of in that area not part of any of those, but they have a presence there, primarily as anti-piracy. India has at time deployed sort of naval assets into the Western Indian Ocean, sort of in the context of all of this going on. So the impact so the impact has been, significant, but perhaps overstated, at least looking at the last year. So insurance rates for ships have gone up from something like 0.1 against the value of the ship to 1% of the value of the ship. So this is significantly, and for ships transiting the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So you've seen a lot of the major carriers travel sort of around the Cape of Good Hope and elsewhere. In terms of its impacts on sort of prices and everything, worldwide, that's kind of not necessary. It's not been as big of an issue in terms of inflationary impacts that going the longer route. The littoral countries, as I stated, are having a hard time of it. So, ports around the Red Sea that can't bypass the Bab el-Mandeb are having issues. The Suez Canal is having issues. Israel's ports are having issues. I imagine if you look at the port of Jeddah, maybe it's not having the greatest time. So that's generally
that's actually because India had inaugurated this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which was about linking western part like Maharashtra, Gujarat with Oman and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and then going to Israel and then Mediterranean and then Europe.
Looked at in terms of a grand strategy, in this, they did that a couple of years ago, right? From the U.S. perspective, a large part of that is being able to avoid the Houthis, and to mitigate that risk. And I imagine the UAE is very happy with that as well, because then Dubai becomes the major sort of point instead of
Let's see how it turns out, because after the announcement, nothing really concrete has actually taken place because of the Gaza war.
It's worth noting, particularly for audiences in South Asia, the Houthis are aware of this corridor and are very they do propaganda against it and constantly accuse various countries of sort of helping the Israeli sort of siege of Gaza they're accusing Jordan, they accuse Saudi Arabia, they accuse the UAE. So they are aware of it and they're very critical of it. So from an India perspective, just something to be aware of.
Yeah, it's actually that's why none of there was a 60-day window. Because the plan was inaugurated on 8th or 10th of September last year. So 60-day window means September, October, November, December. What happened to the meeting of all the partners and the stakeholders, we don't know. But the rhetoric is that the work is going on, the cables are being, built up and the connection lines are being set up. I'm not very sure what is the longevity or sustainability of these kinds of claims, or if they're credible.
We'll see.
In the next 5 to 10 years. So go ahead. So I just wanted to, with this, thank you, sir. And I would ask them all to read more about Yemen so that they're able to, go back to this lecture